I stepped off a research vessel after 4 months at sea, my phone finally catching a signal for the first time since March. Standing on the dock with my duffel bag still slung over one shoulder, the ground beneath me still swaying slightly the way it does for a day or two after months on open water. My phone buzzed itself awake with weeks of backlogged notifications, and the first voicemail that played was from a stranger. "Hi, this is Carl, from the title company. Just confirming, you're okay with us proceeding without you present at the walkthrough, correct?" I stood on that dock with salt still crusted in my hair and had absolutely no idea who Carl was, or what walkthrough he was talking about. I played it twice more, certain I'd misheard something, before I finally called the number back. I found out within the hour. My parents had sold my grandmother's beach house, while I was somewhere in the middle of the Pacific with no way to say no. Welcome to Sweet Payback Stories. Tonight's story begins with a voicemail from a stranger, and ends with a family finding out exactly how much can unravel once the person they thought was unreachable finally comes home. My name is Nadia Okafor. I'm 33 years old, and I work as a marine biologist, which means I spend a significant portion of every year on research vessels with limited or non-existent communication, sometimes weeks at a stretch with no signal at all. I want you to hold on to that detail, because it's the exact condition my family was counting on when they decided that 4 months of silence was long enough to act without me. The house at the center of this story belonged to my grandmother, Adiz, a stubborn, sharp-eyed woman who bought a modest 2-bedroom cottage on the coast back in the 70s, long before that stretch of shoreline became fashionable, and spent the next 4 decades slowly turning it into the one place our entire family actually gathered without fighting. I remember summers there as a kid. Sand tracked through the whole house no matter how many times she swept the porch, her insisting every single grandchild learn to fillet a fish properly before they were allowed to complain about being bored. When she passed 4 years ago, her will left the house to me specifically, along with a handwritten codicil, attached in her own looping cursive, expressing her hope that it would stay in the family and never become a business. I remember reading that line for the first time in the attorney's office, my hands not quite steady, understanding even then that she'd written it, because she knew, better than any of us wanted to admit, exactly what kind of pressure a valuable piece of coastal property eventually attracts. I'd kept that will and codicil filed carefully away since her estate closed, not because I expected to ever need them again, but because they mattered to me, a physical record of the one thing she'd asked of whoever inherited that house. I want to explain something about my family before I go further, because it matters for understanding how this happened at all. My father runs a small boat charter company, 6 employees, most of them men he's known for 20 years, work he built from nothing over 2 decades of hard, physical labor, starting with a single second-hand boat he financed against our own family car when I was still in elementary school. It had been struggling for the better part of 3 years by the time I left for this last expedition, quietly, the way businesses struggle when the owner is too proud to say so directly to his own children. A slow accumulation of smaller signs I'd noticed without fully registering. A boat sold off 2 summers ago that never got replaced. My father's phone calls growing shorter and more distracted whenever I asked how work was going. My brother Femi, 2 years younger than me, works alongside him some seasons and pursues his own freelance photography the rest of the year, caught, the way middle children in small family businesses often are, between loyalty to our father and a life of his own he's never quite fully built. 6 years ago, before a short research fellowship overseas, I signed a limited power of attorney authorizing my father to handle specific banking matters on my behalf while I was out of the country, a routine document my attorney at the time recommended for exactly that kind of temporary absence, covering things like depositing a research stipend check, or handling a utility bill if something went wrong while I was unreachable. When I came back 4 months later, I told him, in person, standing in his kitchen, the same kitchen this whole story eventually returns to, that I considered that arrangement closed, that I appreciated his help, but didn't need it going forward. He'd nodded, said something easy like of course, whatever you need, and I remember feeling, at the time, like the conversation had settled the matter completely. I never formally revoked the document in writing. I want to be honest that this is the one place in this story where my own carelessness genuinely contributed to what happened. A piece of unfinished paperwork I never once thought to worry about again, because I trusted the conversation in that kitchen had settled it, the way you trust most ordinary family conversations to actually mean what they sound like they mean. I found out, once I finally got Carl from the title company on the phone properly, standing in the parking lot of the marina still holding my duffel bag, that the closing had already happened 3 full days before I ever heard his voicemail. Deed recorded. Funds disbursed. A house my grandmother had specifically left to me, sold and gone, before I even knew there was anything happening at all. I asked Carl, my voice steadier than I actually felt, how exactly this had been authorized without me present. He read off a document number, a power of attorney, dated 6 years earlier. My own signature, he confirmed, cheerfully, completely unaware he was delivering the worst news of my adult life in the same tone he'd used to confirm a dinner reservation. I drove straight to my parents' house from the marina, still in my field clothes, salt-stiff and exhausted, and found my mother in the kitchen, my father out back working on one of the boats, the smell of fish and diesel still clinging to the whole property the way it always had growing up. I didn't yell. I want to be clear about that, because I think the calm version of this confrontation matters more than a screaming one would have. I set my duffel bag down by the door and asked her directly whether she knew the house had been sold. She didn't deny it, which I remember being strangely grateful for, even in that moment, some part of me having braced for a longer, more exhausting lie. "We were going to tell you when you got back properly," she said, drying her hands on a towel that didn't need drying, not quite looking at me. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." I asked her what "like this" meant, exactly, since as far as I could tell, it had happened exactly the way someone would want it to happen if they didn't want the actual owner involved at all. She set the towel down and said, quietly, "Your father was going to lose everything, Nadia. We didn't have time to wait for you to come back and have a whole conversation about it." I told her that not having time for a conversation was exactly the problem, and she didn't have an answer for that either. Going back through my own files that same week, I pulled the closing documents from Carl's office and compared the notarized signature page to my actual passport signature, laid out side by side on my kitchen table under good light, an old magnifying glass from a college genetics course pulled out of a drawer out of pure habit. I'm not a handwriting expert, but I didn't need to be. The loop on the N was wrong, too rounded, my actual signature rushed and slanted in a way this one wasn't, the pressure inconsistent in places a genuine signature, written quickly without thinking, never is. It wasn't a masterful forgery. It was good enough to pass a notary who, I learned within days, was a longtime family friend, a woman named Priscilla who'd known my parents for over 15 years, who'd been to my own childhood birthday parties, who had apparently looked at a signature that wasn't mine and notarized it anyway without asking a single hard question. I hired an attorney that same week, a careful, unhurried man named Desmond who specializes in property disputes, meeting him first in a small downtown office that smelled like old coffee and printer toner, and the first thing he did was pull the financial trail behind the sale. "Before we talk about intent, we talk about money," he told me, sliding a legal pad across the desk. "Money tells you things people won't." What came back explained the urgency behind all of it more clearly than any conversation with my parents had. The sale proceeds, nearly all of it, had been transferred within 48 hours of closing into a business account tied directly to my father's charter company. Not a family emergency fund. Not shared savings. A direct injection into a business that had, apparently, been closer to collapse than any of us outside my father had realized, the account records showing a balance that had been dangerously close to zero for weeks before the sale finally closed. Desmond's office also pulled the real estate agent's file, Standard discovery for a case like this, and buried in an email chain going back nearly 2 months before closing was my brother Femi's name, listed early on as family point of contact, coordinating scheduling details with the agent, confirming access for inspectors, present in conversations that had clearly been happening for weeks, not days. This wasn't a single panicked decision made in a rush. It had been planned, staffed, and quietly executed while I was somewhere in the Pacific with no way to weigh in. What made it worse, once Desmond dug further, was learning who had actually bought the house. My parents later insisted, when I finally confronted them directly, that they believed they were selling to a retiring couple looking for a quiet coastal property, people who'd apparently toured the house once and seemed, in my mother's words, just lovely. The buyer of record, once Desmond pulled the actual LLC filing behind the purchase, was a development company with a documented pattern, publicly available through county permit records, of converting exactly this kind of single-family coastal property into short-term rental complexes, gutting the interiors, subdividing where zoning allowed it. The same company responsible for 3 other conversions along that same stretch of coastline in the past 5 years, each one, according to local permit records, stripped down to studs within months of closing. The exact outcome my grandmother's handwritten codicil had specifically hoped to prevent, sold out from under her wishes by the people she'd trusted most to honor them. A neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, who'd lived 2 houses down from my grandmother's cottage since before I was born, mentioned something to me almost in passing when I stopped by to see the house one last time, before the sale could be formally challenged. She was out watering the same hibiscus bushes she'd been tending my entire life, and she waved me over the moment she saw me, delighted, before her face shifted into something more careful once she registered the state I was in. I figured it was you, dear, until I saw her up close later at the mailbox and realized I didn't recognize her at all, she said, describing an unfamiliar woman she'd noticed the week before closing, letting the inspector and photographer into the house, moving through the rooms with a kind of easy familiarity that suggested she belonged there. She had a key and everything. Let herself right in like she owned the place. I asked her what the woman looked like, and Mrs. Alvarez described her in enough detail that, combined with what Desmond later uncovered, we were able to identify her. A friend of my mother's, present, informally, to smooth over any questions from the inspector or photographer about the owner's absence, quietly standing in for me without ever once being asked to by anyone with the actual authority to ask. Desmond's investigation into the notary, Priscilla, turned up something that reframed the whole forged signature in an even more damning light. She was already, at the time of my closing, facing a separate, unrelated complaint before the state notary board for improper witnessing on an entirely different transaction months earlier, a case involving an elderly client and a family member eager to finalize a property transfer before anyone could ask too many questions. My parents hadn't simply gotten lucky with a careless notary. They'd known, or at minimum strongly suspected, exactly who among their circle of longtime friends would notarize a signature without asking too many questions, and they'd used that specific, compromised relationship deliberately. Desmond told me, in his careful, unhurried way, that in his 15 years handling property disputes, he'd rarely seen a case where the choice of notary alone told him quite so much about premeditation. I confronted Femi alone, without our parents present, over coffee at a diner neither of us finished our food at, the same diner we used to stop at as kids after fishing trips with Dad. I expected defensiveness. What I got instead was something closer to genuine grief. He turned his mug slowly on the table for a long moment before he spoke. He came to me nearly 2 months before you got back, Femi said, not quite meeting my eyes. Laid out the whole thing, exactly how close the business actually was to closing entirely within the month without an infusion of real cash. 6 longtime employees, Nadia. Men I've called uncle my whole life. He said it was the only option left. I asked him why nobody had simply called me. Satellite phones exist, message relays exist, there were ways to reach me if it was truly that urgent. He was quiet for a moment. Dad said you'd say no. And he said if you said no and we waited, everyone lost their jobs anyway, and then we'd have lost the business and the house both. I told him that wasn't his decision to make on my behalf, and he nodded, slowly, not arguing. I knew it was wrong, he said. I knew it while I was still doing it. I just couldn't figure out how to say no to him without the whole thing collapsing on people who didn't do anything to deserve losing their jobs. I didn't forgive him in that diner booth. But I understood him, which is a different, more complicated thing entirely. My Aunt Corinne, my father's older sister, told me something during a phone call that week that reframed the entire pattern for me. I could hear her hesitating even before she said it, the specific pause of someone weighing loyalty to a sibling against loyalty to the truth. This isn't the first time, Nadia, she finally said. Years ago, before you were old enough to really understand what was happening, they tried something similar with a rental property that belonged to your cousin Efima. Quieter version of the same thing. Efima caught wind of it early, before it ever became official, and raised enough of a fuss that they backed off entirely. I asked her why nobody had ever mentioned this to me. Because it never actually happened, in the end, Corinne said. Families bury the ones that get stopped in time. It's the ones that go all the way through that you can't bury anymore. She was quiet for a moment. Your parents have always believed family property is a little bit communal when things get desperate enough. This isn't new. It's just the first time it actually went all the way through. Desmond notified the title insurance company underwriting the sale of the forgery claim. Standard procedure, and what happened next surprised me more than almost anything else in this entire ordeal. The title insurer, facing its own significant liability exposure for having underwritten a fraudulent transfer, launched an independent investigation of its own, entirely separate from my legal claim, with resources and urgency neither Desmond nor I could have generated alone. A dedicated claims investigator named Harriet who called me directly within days to walk through the timeline in methodical, exhaustive detail. We take this kind of thing very seriously, she told me on that first call, her tone entirely businesslike, unbothered by the emotional weight of what she was actually investigating, which I found, strangely, comforting. If this transfer is fraudulent, our exposure is significant, and we're going to want to know exactly how it happened just as much as you do, maybe more. Within weeks, their own findings, comparing signatures, reviewing the notary's compromised standing, cross-referencing the timeline, aligned almost exactly with what Desmond had already built. Two entirely separate investigations converging on the same conclusion from two entirely different motivations. My mother's defense, when it finally came, revealed more about what she actually believed than any accusation from me could have. We were sitting at that same kitchen table, weeks after the initial confrontation, Desmond's investigation well underway by then. We always intended to make it right eventually, she said, refusing to quite meet my eyes, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands. It's not like you used that house all that often anyway. You're always off on some boat somewhere. I felt something in my chest go very still and very clear, the same feeling I get right before identifying a specimen I've been circling for hours. I didn't raise my voice. I simply pulled up my own research logs on my phone, the actual, documented travel and expedition schedule I'd kept meticulously for years, months of dates laid out in a spreadsheet I'd built originally just to track my own field hours for grant reporting. I turned the phone toward her and showed her exactly how many weekends and gaps between expeditions I'd spent at that house over the past 4 years, more than either of my parents had visited in the same stretch of time, including the 2 Christmases they'd chosen to spend with my mother's side of the family instead. She looked at the screen for a long moment, her mouth opening slightly like she wanted to argue with a spreadsheet, and then closing again. She didn't have anything to say to that. It's the only time in this entire ordeal I watched her go completely, genuinely quiet. The sale ultimately unwound not through a prolonged courtroom battle, but through the title insurer's own investigation, combined with Desmond's forgery evidence, sufficient at the underwriting level to void the transaction entirely. The development company, once the fraud became clear and public record, withdrew without a fight, unwilling to risk its own reputation over property acquired through a forged signature, the kind of publicity no acquisitions team wants attached to their name. I regained full ownership of the house within 4 months of that voicemail from Carl, formally revoking every prior power of attorney in writing this time, filed properly, redundantly, with copies held by Desmond, my bank, and the county recorder's office, a mistake I have no intention of ever repeating. I chose not to pursue criminal charges against my parents, a decision I made carefully, not out of forgiveness exactly, but at Feme's quiet, genuine request, on the specific condition that the charter business's remaining debt be restructured through a legitimate, fully disclosed family loan agreement, drafted by Desmond, with real repayment terms, rather than ever touching that house, or any part of my life, again without my knowledge. My relationship with my parents remains distant, careful, entirely lacking the dramatic full reconciliation you might expect from a story like this one. We speak, occasionally, briefly, the specific caution of people who've learned exactly how far the other is capable of going when desperate enough. My father has never fully apologized, not in the complete, unqualified way I once might have wanted. My mother has, once, quietly, standing in that same kitchen months later, though I still don't know entirely what to do with it. Feme and I, by contrast, ended up closer than we've been in years, the specific closeness that sometimes comes from two people weathering something difficult together and choosing, afterward, to actually talk about it honestly instead of letting it settle into silence. He helped me repaint the cottage's back porch last month, the two of us working in comfortable quiet most of the afternoon, the same porch our grandmother used to sit on shelling peas while we ran wild in the yard below. At one point he told me, without my asking, that he'd started keeping his own separate savings account, small, modest, entirely his, the first thing in years that belonged to him without our father's business attached to it in some way. Felt strange at first, he said, wiping paint off his hands. Having something that's just mine. I think I forgot that was allowed. We didn't say much else about it. We didn't need to. The house itself has become something new. I didn't sell it. I didn't rent it out the way the development company once intended. I run it now, quietly, as a modest seasonal retreat, a handful of weeks a year, friends and colleagues from the research world who need somewhere quiet to write up findings, or simply rest between expeditions. Exactly the kind of gathering place my grandmother always intended it to be, never quite a business in the way her codicil worried about. Always, somehow, still simply family. Just a wider, more chosen version of it than the one I grew up inside. Last month, a young graduate student I mentor spent 2 weeks there finishing her thesis, and she sent me a photo before she left, the same porch, the same light coming off the water in the late afternoon, and I sat with that photo for a long time, thinking about how strange it is that the place almost stolen from me entirely has become, if anything, more exactly what it was always meant to be. I think about that voicemail sometimes, Carl's cheerful, unknowing voice confirming a walkthrough I'd never agreed to, standing on that dock with salt still in my hair, the whole ordinary architecture of my life about to shift underneath me before I'd even fully readjusted to solid ground. I don't think about it with the same sharp shock anymore. I think about it as the exact moment I learned precisely how much 4 months of silence can cost you, and precisely how much can still, carefully, patiently, be rebuilt once you finally come home to face it. I think, too, about my grandmother, about that looping cursive codicil she never could have known would one day become the single piece of paper that saved the exact thing she was trying to protect. Proof that sometimes the people who love us best plan for a danger they can't quite name yet, simply because they understand, better than anyone, what family is actually capable of when desperate enough. If there's a piece of paper sitting quietly in your own life, an old authorization, a forgotten agreement, something you assumed was long settled simply because you once had the conversation out loud, I hope the story reminds you to close the loop properly, in writing, before someone else decides to close it for you. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one in the comments. And if you believe patience and documented truth can undo even a forged signature, stay close.